So, it's been a little over 2 months since The Haunting of Bly Manor dropped on Netflix, and the conversations surrounding the series have been interesting, to say the least. The series came as a surprise to fans of The Haunting of Hill House, who honestly expected it to offer the same kind of Stephen King-style scares that were all over that series. Instead, Bly Manor is practically devoid of any jump scares, and strives to be a much moodier kind of ghost story. Both shows were created by Mike Flanagan, who happens to be one of the most talented horror filmmakers working today. But while Hill House and Bly Manor are both loose adaptations of pre-existing source material, they have two very different origin points. Based on a Shirley Jackson novel, Hill House was a product of the same visceral, psychological horror made popular not only by Jackson, but also Stephen King. The series even used the same split timeline structure as King's It, jumping back and forth from its characters' childhoods to their troubled adult lives. Bly Manor, on the other hand, is largely inspired by the ghost stories of Henry James, a writer who often sought to avoid many of the tropes that other horror writers usually traffic in. James preferred to create ghosts out of less fantastical means than writers like King and Jackson, crafting stories where, according to him, the strange and the sinister were embroidered on the very type of normal and easy. James's stories opted for a more gothic, uncanny form of ghost story, one in which his characters' personal regrets and paranoia were more often the cause of their traumas than any pre-existing malevolent forces. Bly Manor takes a similar approach to its storytelling, and although the series isn't nearly as nightmare-inducing or nerve-wracking of an experience as Hill House was, I honestly think it's just as compelling of a story. In fact, the series is so thematically consistent that I think The Haunting of Bly Manor may stand the test of time more than even Hill House. So let's talk about that. How Bly Manor exists within the gothic romance genre, and how the relationships between its living and non-living characters reinforce the show's overall themes. Because if The Haunting of Hill House is about trauma, then The Haunting of Bly Manor is about love, and all the countless ways it can leave us, haunted.
I liked your story, but I think you set it up wrong just in the beginning.
Is that so?
You said it was a ghost story. It isn't.
No?
It's a love story.
Same thing, really.
What's the difference between horror films and Gothic romance?
Gothic romance is acknowledged as the first genre to speak of the explained supernatural. So ghosts were emotions trapped in time. It was a way of expressing things about society in the 18th century that were repressed, which were sexuality and the fear of death. So these two forces of love and death are at war with each other in Gothic romance.
One of the most interesting things about The Haunting of Bly Manor is that, unlike Hill House, it isn't really a horror series. Although the show has its fair share of scares, Bly Manor has much more in common with the Gothic romance genre than it does horror, and that may be why the series has been difficult for some fans to wrap their heads around. As a genre, Gothic romance resides in a very specific field of storytelling, one where the mood, setting, time period, and emotions are not only all intricately tied together, but also extreme in their very nature. One of the most beloved, yet idiosyncratic subgenres in all of fiction, the Gothic romance genre is generally believed to have originated with Henry Walpole's 1764 novel, The Castle of Otranto. While the genre itself would become more refined and perfected in later years by authors like Anne Radcliffe or Mary Shelley, Walpole's novel did introduce many of the elements that have come to define the genre, including an ominous old estate as its setting, the use of various supernatural elements, cursed families, and manipulative male figures. And in the preface for the second edition of the novel, Walpole even called the story his, quote, attempt to blend the two kinds of romance, the ancient and the modern. The Haunting of Bly Manor certainly does this. Kate Siegel's Viola very much inhabits a now ancient world, and her supernatural existence impacts every other relationship in the series. Notably, many of Bly Manor's characters also inhabit the same archetypal roles that are found all over Victorian-era fiction. There is the governess, the cook, the caretaker, the gardener, the innocent but strange children, the dead parents, the distant father figure. And in the form of Peter Quint, Bly Manor has the most identifiable of all Gothic romance figures, the Byronic hero. Charming and handsome, the character is often a brooding and self-loathing man who has a dark past that is not at first revealed to the reader. Many of the most iconic Gothic romance stories ever, like Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca or Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, feature their own form of a Byronic hero, and they usually focus on the complicated relationship he begins with an unsuspecting young woman. But Bly Manor goes further than most Gothic romance stories. While it does have its own version of both the Byronic hero and the young woman who falls for him, Bly Manor uses its runtime and scope to depict not just one, but multiple forms of love. The toxic, the illicit, the unrequited, the possessive, and ultimately, the liberating. Now, to be clear, The Haunting of Bly Manor isn't just about love. Its theme is not that love takes many forms. Instead, what Bly Manor argues is that every love story is a ghost story. And the series drives that point home not only by depicting love in all these various ways, but also by having the show's core relationships all end in ways that reflect the very nature of them. The show makes it explicitly clear over the course of its season that the relationship between Rebecca and Peter isn't a healthy one. Peter demands an unreasonable level of commitment from Rebecca, and she, blinded by her love for him, doesn't realize what she's sacrificing by doing so. It's fitting then that it's Rebecca's decision to give herself fully over to Peter, despite not totally understanding what that means or what his intentions are, that kills her. Conversely, it's Peter's toxic, manipulative need to control Rebecca that leads him to steal her life away from her and drown her in the lake in the first place. Similarly, it's Viola's suffocating need to keep Bly, her husband, and her daughter all to herself that leads to Perdita strangling her. And, in a truly brilliant bit of irony, it's not her family that Viola becomes linked to in the afterlife, or even Bly, but a chest of her own superficial possessions, a collection of things she demanded to keep ownership of even after her own time was up. And it's Charlotte's relationship with Henry, which threatens to forge a wedge between her and her family, that leads her and Dominic to go on the trip that claims both of their lives. It's not Charlotte's ghost who haunts Henry either, but a guilty conscience, one that verbalizes the very self-loathing he feels about the affair. Even a minor character like Eddie, who Danny felt obligated to be with, is killed by his own inability to recognize her independence. And why does his ghost appear to Danny in mirrors? Because what better visual symbol could there be for the connection Danny feels between her own identity and the guilt she harbors over his death? And then there's Hannah.
You're Hannah Grace. The year is 1987. You were at Bly. Miles is 10. Florrie's 8.
Fiercely dedicated to taking care of Bly, it's Hannah's commitment to putting Miles, Flora, and Bly above herself that results in her not only getting killed on the property, but also continuing to serve as caretaker in the afterlife, unaware the whole time that her own life has already ended. The tragedy extends even further though, reaching into her relationship with Owen. Although both characters clearly love each other, neither say it out loud. It's left unspoken, unrequited. And as a result, in her final scene of the series, Hannah's parting words to him are left.
Please tell Owen I'm sorry. Tell him I love him. And the rest, well, it's just...
unfinished. I want to be clear right now and say that I don't necessarily think all of these thematic examples or symbols were completely planned or intended by the Bly Manor writers. It's entirely possible that, as is often the case in fiction, coincidence and meaning is discovered by the readers and viewers, not by the writers themselves. But it is a testament to what happens when everyone involved in a project understands exactly the theme of whatever they're making is. Because when the thematic understanding of a series is so clear throughout the making of it, then every character, plot line, story point, and twist will, inevitably in some way, connect back to the idea at the heart of it. In the case of Bly Manor, the idea that every love story is a ghost story is reflected in the very nature of its hauntings. And that's what intelligent, compelling, and well-structured storytelling is. It's moving, and it's thematically sound from top to bottom. Now, before I go, I do want to take a small moment and talk about my favorite storyline in The Haunting of Bly Manor. The piece of writing that I think is not only the most emotionally moving that the series has to offer, but also the most original and provocative. I want to talk about Danny and Jamie.
People do, don't they? Mix up love and possession. Yeah, they do. I don't think that should be possible.
Most of the discussion around Bly Manor has pointed to Henry James's The Turn of the Screw as being the biggest inspiration for the series. And to be fair, a large part of the show's plot does come from that particular story. But I actually think it's another one of James's ghost stories, lesser known than The Turn of the Screw, that had the biggest thematic impact on Bly Manor. I'm talking about his 1903 novella, The Beast in the Jungle, which Bly Manor's finale episode is named after. The novella follows a man who believes his life will be defined by a major, likely catastrophic event. He believes the event, whatever it may be, is waiting for him like a quote-unquote beast in the jungle. Paranoid and distant, he chooses to spend his life alone, in the hopes of sparing anyone else a part in whatever so-called spectacular fate is awaiting him. He keeps to his vows, even after a caring woman who knows about his secret decides to wait for the beast with him. The story ends when she passes away, and the man, mourning her, realizes that the catastrophic event he thought would define his life was, in fact, his own choice to let it all pass him by. His supposed beast in the jungle was, in all actuality, his fear of it. As he thinks to himself in the story's final paragraph, it was the truth, vivid and monstrous, that all the while he had waited, the wait was itself his portion. The escape would have been to love her. Then, he would have lived. Like in so many of James's ghost stories, the Bly Manor finale makes it clear that the most horrifying things aren't malevolent ghosts, but things left unsaid, mistakes made, relationships gone wrong, and opportunities missed. Unlike the troubled family members in The Haunting of Hill House, who are haunted by traumas they experienced as children, the characters in The Haunting of Bly Manor are all haunted by love. But Jamie is haunted by her connection to Danny in a very different way than the rest of Bly Manor's characters. Because unlike the toxic, manipulative bond that killed both Rebecca and Peter, or the hesitation that cost Owen and Hannah their time together, Danny and Jamie's relationship was supportive. It was open and freeing, despite both knowing all the while that it wouldn't last forever. Because, unlike the protagonist in James's The Beast in the Jungle, the characters chose not to let the doomed nature of their relationship keep them from connecting. As a result, Mike Flanagan and all of his collaborators, they communicate the very same message that James did in his novella about loving no matter the consequences through entirely different means than James did. Jamie discovers the value of love not by avoiding it at all costs, but by committing to it. It's a unique storytelling feat, especially in a genre that is so defined by its doomed romances and ill-fated partnerships. And then all of this culminates in an ending that feels surprisingly refreshing and unique. One that is staggeringly different from not only the ending of The Haunting of Hill House, but most gothic romances. It's an ending in which love's supernatural hold isn't just manifested as a lake for the living to drown themselves in, but also as a hand on their shoulder, always there, comforting them through the night. At least, that's my opinion.